Hey guys, today we're diving into another truly horrifying case. If you want to support my channel, make sure to subscribe and stay active. It really helps me out. I'd be super grateful for that. Let's get started. On the evening of October 24th, 2009, 58-year-old Chris Marks, a successful professional and devoted mother, left her home with a sense of hope. She was on her way to reconnect with her daughter Taylor, who was 20 years old and had been adopted by Chris years earlier. Earlier that day, Taylor had called, asking Chris to pick her up from her boyfriend Brian's house. This request was an unexpected olive branch after a long period of tension between them. Chris arrived at Brian's house around 7 p.m. The neighborhood, located in Akron, Ohio, was known for its high crime rates and general sense of unease. Despite her apprehensions, Chris parked her car, walked to the door, and knocked. Taylor answered, and Chris, struggling to contain her joy, embraced her. There seemed to be no visible tension between them. Shortly after, Brian joined them to escort both women back to Chris's car. To Chris, everything seemed normal, though the area itself left her uneasy. As they walked toward the car, the situation took a terrifying turn. A man suddenly appeared behind them, armed with a knife. The attack was swift and brutal. Chris was struck multiple times in the chest and face before she had a chance to defend herself. She collapsed to the ground. Taylor screamed and quickly grabbed her phone to call emergency services. In the recording of her call, she can be heard pleading for help, explaining that her mother had been attacked. While Taylor was on the line with the dispatcher, Brian took the phone from her. He provided their location and described the incident, claiming the attacker had fled. His tone was unnervingly calm, lacking the urgency one might expect from someone who had just witnessed such a violent event. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Chris was still alive, but in critical condition. She was transported to the hospital, where doctors worked tirelessly to save her. Despite their efforts, Chris Marks was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The primary cause of death was multiple stab wounds inflicted with alarming force. At the scene, law enforcement quickly noted several inconsistencies. Chris's purse, containing her belongings, cash, keys, and documents, was found untouched near the site of the attack. This detail conflicted with the typical pattern of a robbery. Additionally, a bloodied knife, believed to be the weapon used, was discovered in nearby bushes. These findings raised questions about the accounts provided by the witnesses and suggested the possibility of deeper motives behind the crime. The police began questioning everyone involved: Taylor, Brian, and Brian's friend Troy, who had been inside the house during the attack. Their accounts were inconsistent and contradictory. Taylor claimed she had only seen the silhouette of the attacker, describing someone wearing red sneakers and a flannel shirt. Brian stated that he tried to intervene and even suffered injuries while struggling with the assailant. Troy, however, insisted he had never left the house and claimed he saw nothing. Despite their statements, investigators quickly suspected that none of them were telling the truth. Evidence found at the scene, including blood trails and the placement of the weapon, suggested a staged crime. Authorities believed the attack wasn't random, but instead carefully planned. The first night of the investigation was spent under the intense scrutiny of detectives who were left with one burning question: why would someone target Chris? And which of the people present knew what really happened? Taylor Marks was born on March 29, 1989. Her biological mother decided to place her in foster care immediately after her birth, leaving the infant in the care of the adoption system. Little is known about her biological family, except that Taylor had at least one older sibling, though she was the only one placed in foster care. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life, a chapter that, despite its challenging start, eventually brought warmth and care. A few months later, Taylor became part of the Marks family, Bruce and Chris Marks. The couple had long dreamed of having a child, as they were unable to have children of their own. When they first saw Taylor, they knew she was meant to be part of their family. At the time, the Marks family was financially stable. Bruce held a senior position at a major telecommunications company, while Chris, known for her organizational skills, managed the household and helped nurture their home life. They had a large and close-knit extended family, and Taylor was embraced with love. Relatives, including grandparents, aunts, uncles, and many cousins, surrounded her with care and support. Bruce and Chris were deeply invested in raising Taylor. She attended prestigious private schools, participated in dance classes, and took part in other extracurricular activities. Her life was filled with opportunities that many of her peers didn't have. Taylor, however, shared a particularly close bond with Bruce. According to family friends, Bruce was her hero dad, always fulfilling her wishes and supporting her unconditionally. Her relationship with Chris, on the other hand, was different. Chris was stricter, more demanding, and practical. While these differences in parenting styles didn't cause significant issues during Taylor's early years, tensions began to emerge as she grew older. During her teenage years, Taylor faced increasing oversight and higher expectations from her mother, which became a frequent source of conflict. The family's dynamic began to deteriorate against the backdrop of growing disagreements. When Taylor was around 10 years old, Chris and Bruce faced marital issues that eventually led to their divorce. According to Taylor, her parents' separation deeply affected her emotionally. She felt that Chris began channeling her frustrations toward her, which further strained their relationship. A pivotal moment in Taylor's life came in 2002 when she was just 13 years old. Bruce passed away suddenly after falling into a diabetic coma. His death was a devastating blow for Taylor, who lost not only her father, but also her strongest source of emotional support. Shortly after, her grandfather, to whom she was also very close, passed away as well. These consecutive losses left Taylor with deep emotional wounds. Following Bruce's death, Chris inherited a substantial estate, including a large sum of money. She used part of the inheritance to purchase a new home in Akron, Ohio, hoping a change of scenery would provide a fresh start for her and Taylor. However, Taylor's emotional state continued to decline. She became more withdrawn, her academic performance suffered, and her conflicts with Chris intensified. Chris tried to support her daughter, but her methods often came across as overly controlling. She attempted to compensate for the loss of Bruce by providing Taylor with material comforts, often going above and beyond to give her everything she needed, and more. However, the emotional connection between them continued to fade. Chris hoped her daughter would eventually take responsibility, finish her education, and one day carry on the family legacy. But Taylor had no interest in these plans, dreaming instead of breaking free from what she saw as imposed expectations. As Taylor entered her teenage years, her quest for independence clashed with her mother's expectations. This marked the beginning of escalating conflicts that only worsened over time. Taylor viewed her mother as a constant source of pressure. With each passing year, tensions grew. Chris tried to enforce strict rules to steer Taylor in what she believed was the right direction. She became increasingly worried about her daughter's declining grades, lack of focus on school, and apparent indifference toward her future. Taylor, however, saw her mother's actions as an attempt to control her life, fueling her desire to rebel. Chris's constant remarks about Taylor's appearance, choice of clothing, and selection of friends only widened the emotional gap between them. The high school years were particularly challenging. Taylor, with access to the privileges her mother provided, began using them irresponsibly. Instead of focusing on her studies, she preferred to spend time with friends, disregarding Chris's attempts to enforce discipline. Although Chris tried various methods to guide her daughter, they only deepened the divide. A critical turning point came in 2008, the year Taylor graduated from high school. Despite Chris's financial support and her willingness to provide opportunities for Taylor to attend any college, Taylor showed little interest in continuing her education. Chris pushed Taylor to at least try, and Taylor eventually enrolled at a university in Akron. However, just a month into her first semester, Taylor dropped out. For Chris, this decision was a major blow, symbolizing the growing distance and the stark contrast between their dreams for Taylor's future. Realizing that persuasion wasn't working, Chris decided to take a firmer approach. She gave Taylor an ultimatum: either get a job and start supporting herself or move out of the house. This was a common expectation in American culture, where young adults are encouraged to take responsibility for their lives upon reaching adulthood. However, Taylor perceived her mother's words not as motivation, but as cruelty and a threat, deepening the conflict between them. The situation escalated further in May 2009 when Taylor met Brian Smith, a 21-year-old with a reputation as a bad boy. Brian lived in a low-income part of town with his mother and sister. Taylor was quickly drawn to him, seeing in Brian a chance to escape her mother's control. Those who knew Brian described him as having a hot temper and a need to dominate in relationships, but these traits didn't deter Taylor. Chris was strongly opposed to the relationship. She was concerned not only about Brian's behavior, but also about the influence he might have on her daughter. Chris attempted to forbid Taylor from seeing Brian and even banned him from coming to their home. However, these actions only solidified Taylor's resolve. Before long, Taylor packed her belongings and moved in with Brian, leaving her mother's house. Life with Brian was far from the ideal Taylor had imagined. At first, their relationship seemed promising, but it didn't take long for Brian to begin displaying controlling and aggressive behavior. Taylor faced jealousy, control, and frequent outbursts of anger. Despite this, she refused to return home, seeing a move back as an admission of defeat. Concerned for her daughter, Chris continued to provide support. She purchased essentials for Taylor and maintained contact, hoping her daughter would come to recognize her mistakes. The tension between them reached a breaking point when Chris offered Taylor a lifeline. She could come home under the condition that she either resumed her education or found a job. Chris even proposed additional support, offering to provide her with a car, an apartment, and a position at her company. Yet, Taylor showed little interest in these opportunities. Her tumultuous relationship with Brian continued despite the mounting challenges. Chris held on to the hope that time would help Taylor see the error of her ways. She believed that one day her daughter would return home and take on more responsibility. Unfortunately, this hope would never come to fruition. The growing rift in their relationship, compounded over the years, set the stage for the events that would ultimately lead to a tragic outcome. Taylor's move to Brian's home marked the beginning of what she believed to be long-awaited freedom. However, that freedom quickly turned into a series of restrictions. Life with Brian proved far different from her expectations. He imposed strict rules and monitored every aspect of her life. Taylor, accustomed to a certain level of comfort and independence, found herself in an environment where she was expected to comply with Brian's every demand. Brian's control over Taylor soon became all-encompassing. He checked her phone, read her messages, and tightly monitored her movements. Even her communication with Chris became a point of contention. Brian convinced Taylor that her mother was merely trying to manipulate her and prevent her from living life on her terms. His words deepened the already growing divide between Taylor and Chris, who continued to reach out, determined to keep the lines of communication open. In Brian's home, Taylor found herself in complete isolation. Brian not only restricted her social connections, but also manipulated her emotions, portraying himself as the only person who truly understood her. During arguments, he displayed aggressive behavior, breaking objects and making threats. His outbursts were often followed by demands for total loyalty and constant reminders of her dependence on him. The situation was further complicated by the involvement of Brian's family. His mother, Tammy, chose not to intervene, effectively enabling his behavior. His younger sister also played a role in maintaining control over Taylor, acting as a watcher when Brian wasn't around. This created an environment where Taylor's every move was closely monitored. Taylor's financial ties to her mother were another critical factor in her relationship with Brian. Aware of Chris's wealth and Taylor's potential inheritance, Brian was determined to maintain control. He frequently reinforced the idea that her mother was the root of all her problems, further driving a wedge between them. Under Brian's influence, Taylor began avoiding contact with her mother. Even when Chris visited to help her daughter, Brian remained distant and dismissive. He discouraged Taylor from accepting her mother's support, insisting they could handle things on their own. Despite Brian's efforts, Chris continued to provide for Taylor, buying her necessities and urging her to come back home. By the summer of 2009, the tension between Taylor, Brian, and Chris had reached a breaking point. After months of living with Brian, Taylor had become entirely dependent on his influence. Amid increasing control and aggression, an idea began to take shape, something that initially seemed far-fetched, but soon became a concrete plan. This idea was fueled by mounting pressure, mutual dissatisfaction, and financial motives. The plan was to remove Chris permanently, thereby gaining access to her assets. For Taylor, this seemed like a way to sever the last ties connecting her to her mother while also achieving financial independence. For Brian, it was an opportunity to solidify his control over Taylor and use her inheritance to improve his own circumstances. The idea of committing a crime began circulating within their inner circle. Brian's 19-year-old friend, Troy Purdy, who frequently visited their home, became involved in these discussions. Younger and impressionable, Troy was seen as an ideal participant in the plan. Initially, the conversations were framed as jokes or hypothetical scenarios, but over time they became more serious. The planning progressed slowly, with careful attention to every detail. Brian and Taylor deliberated on how to stage the crime to look like a robbery or random attack. They decided that evidence left at the scene should point to an act of spontaneous aggression rather than a premeditated crime. Troy was chosen to carry out the act, distancing Taylor and Brian from any direct connection to the incident. Troy's involvement was based on his loyalty to Brian. He respected Brian and didn't question the plan when approached. In exchange for his role, Troy was promised $5,000, money that Taylor expected to receive from her inheritance once the legal processes were complete. Special attention was given to selecting the weapon. According to Taylor, Brian's mother, Tammy, even purchased a knife for the plan, but it was later deemed unsuitable due to its size and weight. Ultimately, Troy took on the task of finding an appropriate weapon. He chose a lightweight knife that was easy to conceal and carry. A critical part of the preparation involved studying Chris's routines. They knew Chris often visited Brian's house to see Taylor, making her vulnerable since she usually came alone, believing she was simply picking up her daughter. This detail was incorporated into the plan. The scenario envisioned Chris arriving at the house, with the attack occurring as she exited the home or near her car. Just before the plan was set in motion, Taylor made the final move to ensure everything went as intended. She called her mother and asked her to come pick her up, saying she wanted to come back home. This phone call was designed to disarm Chris emotionally, giving her a sense of relief and lowering her guard. Throughout the discussions, Taylor showed no hesitation. According to Troy, she was not only an active participant in the planning, but also displayed a strong determination to see it through. Despite her strained relationship with her mother, taking such a drastic step was extreme. Taylor justified her involvement by citing years of built-up resentment and her desire to escape her mother's control. Brian, meanwhile, guided the process, convincing Taylor that this was the only way to resolve her problems. By the evening of October 24, 2009, everything was ready. Taylor knew the plan was moving from theory to action. She remained calm and focused, believing this was the only path forward. For Chris, this day seemed like the start of reconciliation with her daughter. For Taylor and Brian, it marked what they saw as the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. October 24, 2009, began as a typical day for Chris Marks, but ended in tragedy. That evening, Taylor called her mother and said she wanted to come home. For Chris, this unexpected phone call was a moment of joy. After months of tension, she saw it as an opportunity to reconnect with her daughter. She quickly gathered her things, got in her car, and drove to Brian's house, unaware she was walking into a meticulously planned crime. Chris arrived around 7 p.m. She parked her car near the house and walked to the front door. Taylor greeted her with a smile and hugged her, making it appear as though this was the first step toward reconciliation. Brian followed them out of the house, observing the scene from behind. As planned, Troy stayed inside to avoid drawing suspicion. Chris and Taylor began walking toward the car, with Brian trailing slightly behind, as though escorting them. It appeared to be a routine interaction, but everything changed in an instant. As the two women approached the car, Troy emerged from the house holding the knife. The attack began suddenly and without warning. Chris had no time to react. Troy struck her multiple times in the chest and face. The assault was swift and ferocious, leaving no opportunity for her to defend herself. Chris fell to the ground, having sustained more than 10 stab wounds. This was not a robbery. It was a targeted act of aggression meant to eliminate her. Taylor stood nearby, watching the attack unfold. She later claimed her inaction was due to fear of Troy. However, surveillance footage discovered later showed no signs of panic or distress on her part. Brian also remained passive, stating that his role was merely to protect the women, yet he did nothing to stop Troy. Once the attack was over, Taylor picked up her phone and called emergency services. Her voice sounded tense as she begged for an ambulance to be sent immediately. However, the phone was soon taken by Brian, who assumed the role of coordinator, providing the dispatcher with details about the location and the type of assistance needed. His voice was calm and devoid of emotion, raising suspicions among law enforcement officers who later reviewed the call. Troy, after completing the attack, discarded the knife in a nearby bush and fled the scene. Later, he claimed he acted in a moment of emotional distress, but the evidence suggested his actions were carefully planned. Chris was rushed to the hospital, but despite the medical team's efforts, she could not be saved. She succumbed to multiple stab wounds inflicted with evident fury. Following the tragic death of Chris Marks, the investigation began immediately. Police arrived at the scene just minutes after the call to emergency services. The evidence they found, a knife in the bushes, Chris's purse with all her belongings intact, and the absence of any signs of robbery, immediately raised doubts. The theory of a random attack didn't align with the details. The first step for investigators was to question those involved: Taylor, Brian, and Troy. They were interviewed separately to prevent any chance of coordination. Their accounts, however, were inconsistent and unconvincing. Police quickly noted discrepancies in their statements. The key piece of evidence came from surveillance footage captured near the crime scene. The video showed Taylor and Brian standing nearby as Troy attacked Chris. Neither of them made any attempt to intervene. These recordings became a decisive turning point. Armed with this evidence, detectives revisited the suspects for further questioning. Under the pressure of the evidence, Troy was the first to confess. He admitted that the attack had been premeditated and claimed Taylor was the mastermind behind the plan. According to Troy, she had approached him and Brian with the idea, promising a financial reward from the inheritance she would receive after her mother's death. Troy revealed that his role was to carry out the attack, while Brian was responsible for creating an alibi by making it appear like a robbery. Troy also admitted that he had intentionally inflicted minor wounds on Brian to make the staged scenario more believable. His confession completely dismantled Taylor's earlier claim that the attack was a random event. When Brian learned of Troy's confession, he altered his account as well. He corroborated Troy's statement that Taylor had initiated the plan. However, Brian denied being an active participant, claiming that while he didn't approve of the attack, he felt powerless to stop Taylor and Troy. He also insisted he was unaware of the full details of the plan until the last minute, though this seemed like an attempt to downplay his involvement. Confronted with mounting evidence and accusations, Taylor initially continued to deny her role. However, her version of events became increasingly inconsistent. Investigators noted that she began to contradict herself, and her behavior suggested she was attempting to hide the truth. Eventually, under the weight of the evidence, Taylor admitted to discussing the plan with Brian and Troy. The investigation uncovered numerous details that highlighted the deliberate nature of the crime. The participants meticulously planned every aspect, from choosing the weapon to staging fake injuries. The financial motive, cited by both Troy and Brian, became a central component of the prosecution's case. Taylor admitted that her ongoing conflict with her mother was a driving factor in her decision. However, she claimed she didn't anticipate the situation escalating to such a tragic outcome. Just 5 hours after the crime, police had a comprehensive understanding of what had happened. Taylor Marks, Brian Smith, and Troy Purdy were arrested and charged in connection with the death of Chris Marks. While this concluded the initial phase of the investigation, the legal process was just beginning, as the court would determine their levels of culpability and issue sentencing. The trial for the crime involving Chris Marks began in late 2009. The defendants faced significant public scrutiny due to the brutal nature of the crime and the involvement of people close to the victim. The prosecution built its case on a wealth of evidence, witness testimony, and video recordings. The most compelling piece of evidence was the surveillance footage showing Taylor and Brian standing by and making no effort to intervene during the attack on Chris. Additionally, Troy's confession, which detailed the conspiracy and his role in the crime, became a cornerstone of the case. Investigators also presented text messages found on Taylor's phone, where she had discussed her strained relationship with her mother and expressed a desire to be free of her. The financial motive was further supported by evidence of the substantial inheritance Taylor expected to receive after Chris's death. During the trial, it was revealed that Chris had significant assets, including real estate, a business, and substantial savings. Defense attorneys for Taylor, Brian, and Troy sought to mitigate their client's culpability. Taylor's defense argued that she was under Brian's significant influence and lacked the autonomy to act independently. Her lawyer claimed that the emotional instability caused by her father's death and the pressure from her mother made her vulnerable to manipulation. Brian, on the other hand, denied active involvement in the crime. His attorney argued that he was unaware of the plan until the attack occurred and was paralyzed by shock, unable to intervene. Meanwhile, Troy, despite his initial confession, attempted to partially change his story during the trial, claiming that he acted under pressure from Brian. During the proceedings, Troy agreed to a plea deal with the prosecution. In exchange for admitting his guilt and testifying against the other defendants, he received a sentence of life imprisonment without parole, avoiding the possibility of the death penalty. Taylor, realizing the hopelessness of her situation, also pled guilty. During the hearings, she delivered an emotional statement expressing remorse for her actions. She explained how her conflicts with her mother and Brian's influence had driven her to participate in the crime. However, prosecutors argued that her involvement was deliberate and calculated. Brian, in contrast, initially denied his guilt, but eventually admitted his role when confronted with irrefutable evidence. He maintained that his involvement was minimal and that he had not intended for the crime to occur. But the court viewed this as an attempt to downplay his responsibility. In 2010, the court delivered its verdicts. Taylor Marks and Brian Smith were found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy. Both received life sentences without the possibility of parole. Taylor expressed remorse for her actions, but her claim that she had lost control was seen as an attempt to mitigate her sentence. Troy Purdy, as agreed in his plea deal, also received life imprisonment. However, his behavior in prison later drew attention. In 2015, he was charged with possession of a weapon within the facility, raising questions about his ability to reform. After the sentences were announced, the lives of everyone involved in the tragedy were irrevocably changed. The family of Chris Marks not only lost a mother but also a daughter, who was complicit in her death. The story became a sobering reminder of how personal conflicts and impulsive decisions can destroy even the closest relationships. Taylor, sentenced to life without parole, was sent to a women's correctional facility in Ohio. During her first years in prison, she remained withdrawn, avoiding contact with the press and other inmates. However, in 2021, Taylor gave an interview to a television program about her case. In the interview, Taylor acknowledged the severity of her actions but continued to justify her decisions by citing her conflict with her mother and her emotional instability. Despite her earlier expressions of remorse in court, Taylor reiterated criticisms of her mother, describing her as strict and unsupportive after her father's death. She also mentioned her hope of one day having her case reviewed and being granted a chance at freedom. Her statements sparked controversy, with many interpreting them as a lack of genuine remorse. Taylor now spends her days participating in rehabilitation programs and working within the prison. Her claims of repentance remain polarizing. Some view her as manipulative and insincere, while others see her words as an attempt to find meaning in life behind bars. Brian, also sentenced to life in a high-security prison, has maintained a low profile since his conviction. He has avoided interviews and has not spoken publicly about his role in the crime. According to prison staff, Brian has a reputation as a difficult inmate, prone to conflicts and aggression. His name resurfaced in 2017 when it was reported that he had been involved in a fight with another inmate. The incident underscored that his tendencies toward aggressive behavior had not diminished, even after his sentencing. Like Taylor, Brian remains a symbol of the tragic failure to take responsibility and the devastating influence one can have on others. Troy, who played a direct role in the crime, was also sent to a high-security prison. Despite his plea deal, his behavior behind bars demonstrated a lack of change. Troy has rarely been mentioned in the media since the incident. While his participation in the crime was viewed as the result of manipulation by Brian and Taylor, his willingness to deliver the fatal blows raised doubts about his capacity for rehabilitation. The memory of Chris Marks lives on among her friends and surviving family members. Her senior care business was sold after her death, with part of the proceeds donated to charities supporting victims of domestic aggression. Her relatives and friends have often described Chris as a strong and compassionate woman who dedicated her life to helping others. Years after Chris's death, her story continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the importance of open communication within families and seeking professional help when conflicts spiral out of control. Thanks for watching, everyone. Your support means a lot to me, and you can help my channel grow by hitting that like button, dropping a comment, and sharing this video. Your engagement really makes a difference. See you soon.